10 knights, the strongest humanity had to offer. Every last one of them pushed past their limits, drained of life force and mana, standing on contaminated land where nothing but death remained. This is what the end looks like, not some glorious final stand, but exhaustion and poison and the slow realization that everything you fought for wasn't enough. And the thing responsible for all of it? A single creature? The demon commander of gluttony. One monster turned the continent into a graveyard. The creature stares at our guy Tiny and actually acknowledges him by name, admits he's strong, but then it delivers the kind of truth that hits harder than any attack. His strength is far from sufficient to take its life in battle, just stating facts. No malice, no mockery, just cold assessment from something that has killed everyone else and knows it will kill him too. Tiny's response is to charge forward with a hammer and make the demon regret opening its mouth. He unleashes a thunderous strike that cracks through the battlefield like Judgment Day. The creature withstands it and tells him to give up, that his efforts are futile, and our boy? He literally yells at this ancient horror to shut up. No grand speech, no dramatic last words, just pure irritation at a monster that won't stop talking. He follows up with a meteor summon, bringing celestial fire down on the thing's head, and mutters that it's a noisy bastard. The absolute audacity. He keeps attacking. Every technique, every ounce of strength, everything he has left in a body that's already breaking down. And eventually, silence falls. The demon commander of gluttony is dead. Tiny won. But winning and surviving are two different things. He's severely wounded. His mana is completely depleted. He knows he's going to die here alongside the enemy he just defeated. Classic Pyrrhic victory. Save the world and don't live to see it. As his consciousness starts fading, he reflects on everything that went wrong. And honestly, it was wrong from the very beginning. Mana training was knowledge exclusive to distinguished knights and nobility. Tiny came from the slums. He had to overcome countless setbacks, advancing slower than everyone else, climbing to the top of the knights from the very bottom. He always believed he could overcome those challenges through sheer willpower and pride. Now he's not so sure. If he'd had proper training from the start, maybe he could have saved the continent, saved everyone. Instead, he burned through everything he had just to kill the 7th demon commander. 7th, there are more commanders out there, and a demon king above them all. How strong are they if this one nearly ended humanity? A voice cuts through his fading thoughts, someone asking if Tiny is still alive. He looks over and sees the Sword Emperor himself, Asgard von Valencia, looking equally wrecked. The Emperor admits he'll be dead soon too, but before he goes, he wants to ask one question. Why didn't Tiny flee this battle? He heard the protagonist was a child from the slums. Is there nothing he wishes to protect? Things must have been very difficult for him. Tiny hesitates. Then he admits the question is shameful to answer. But he hates being more inadequate than most. A man must remain confident anywhere he goes. For that reason, he would never flee from a fight. The Emperor immediately starts laughing, not mockingly, genuinely amused by the answer. Tiny points out that the old man seems to have quite a bit of strength left if he can laugh like that. The Emperor says it will work out. That Tiny should trust in the talent that made him one of the 10 strongest knights with only his pride as foundation. Then he says something strange. If Tiny returns, he should find him. Returns? What does that even mean? The Emperor continues. If Tiny recklessly visits him in the past, his younger self probably won't believe the story, so he's giving him proof. His daughter's birth name was Lila. It came from the name of a flower he and his wife liked. Bun. But here's the secret, the part Tiny absolutely cannot forget. The Emperor never truly liked that flower, he just pretended to. That's the most important part. Find him as quickly as possible. Tiny has no idea what's happening. His consciousness is fading. He assumes this is just death playing tricks, the brain firing random signals as everything shuts down. But then he wakes up. The room looks familiar, too familiar. He wonders if he's dead or dreaming, but the details are too specific, too real. He cannot believe he's going through all this again, because this is the past. This is the exact moment after his sister died when those men came to take her body. The memories flood back. He gets irritated whenever he thinks about Arena hiding that gold ring, but then he remembers the truth. It was actually him who hid it. His sister was beaten while trying to protect him. Some guys showed up saying they almost messed up Wolf because of her, that they needed to teach her a lesson so she'd never do it again. They beat her while young Tiny watched, too weak and fragile to do anything. He barely survived with his broken body. And his sister died while taking care of him, even though she was injured herself. What he thought was a distant memory resurfaces in his mind. The men show up again. With just one kick, they knock his sister's body down, boasting about it. She's already dead and they don't stop. As if that weren't enough, they try to take her body. One hesitates, but the other explains there are some sick guys who like dead bodies. Fresh organs can fetch good money too. Just casual conversation about desecrating a corpse. Still a child, Tiny tries to stop them, but he thinks he can't protect her even in his dreams. Lying in bed, he tries with all his strength to move. And something happens. His arm starts to move. Energy arises in his body, responding to his desperate need. He gets what he wanted and advances toward the bad guys. He manages to strike one of them in a way that makes the man actually feel the impact. The thug can't believe what he's witnessing. Then he gets up with his companion, saying this boy must have a death wish. The two gang up to beat the protagonist, telling him he wasn't allowed to leave his bed. Young Tiny resists because he only wants to protect his sister. That's all. That's everything. After beating him severely, the men give up on taking the body due to the boy's persistence. Ironically, they tell him to have fun with his dead sister as they leave. Real classy individuals. But now the protagonist realizes something is different from his past. The ending of the nightmares he's had until now has changed. In every memory, every dream of this moment, they took her body. He failed, but this time they didn't. This time he actually stopped them. He's unsure why the sudden change, still believing he's in a dream. He also remembers that he couldn't manipulate mana at this age. Then he recalls the Emperor's last words and starts to believe he really was sent back to the past. Tiny tests his theory. He tries to manipulate mana, something that should be impossible at this age, but he sees his powers in action. Energy responds to his will. Soon he concludes that the Emperor indeed sent him to the past. This is truly not a dream. Then he complains that the old man made a mistake in sending him now. He wished to be a bit further ahead, precisely because at this time in his life his body is still fragile, but he knows he's just venting uselessly. The Sword Emperor was not confident in his own power. Getting sent back at all was probably a miracle. And there's a silver lining. He can see this as a chance to let his sister rest in peace. In his past life, he couldn't even do that. Her body was taken, desecrated, sold. But this time he protected her. This time he can give her what she deserves. The Emperor told him to find him as quickly as possible. Tiny decides that will have to wait. He has something more important to do first. The protagonist desires revenge against the one who killed his sister, a man known as Wolf. In his past life, he almost killed Wolf by breaking his spine. But almost isn't good enough anymore. This time he wants something more fitting. But before revenge, he wishes to take his sister to a place of rest. Sometime later, he manages to carry her body to a cemetery. It's not much, a simple grave in an unremarkable place, but it's hers. A place where she can finally be at peace, where no one will ever touch her again. He stands over the fresh earth and makes a silent promise. He's going to change everything. The future he lived through, the catastrophes that destroyed humanity, the demon commanders, and the demon king, all of it. He has the knowledge of what's coming and the skills of one of the 10 strongest knights locked inside a child's body. It's not ideal. It's not what he would have chosen. But it's a second chance. And he's not going to waste it. Wolf isn't hard to find. Men like him don't hide. They operate out of a place called Invader, the red light district of Phus, where every kind of vice thrives under the protection of people who should know better. Tiny tracks him down and approaches the hideout, fully aware that he's walking into enemy territory with a child's body and the combat instincts of a legendary knight. Some of Wolf's men recognize him immediately, one of the slum kids. They think they can take his money all at once, just another easy score. But as they approach, Tiny asks a simple question. Where is Wolf? One of them gets irritated and asks how he dares say that name, claiming the boy must have lost his mind. He tries to slap Tiny but gets stopped mid-swing. The protagonist asks what's wrong with mentioning Wolf's name while gripping the man's arm tightly enough to make him scream in pain. His partner watches his friend drop to the ground and wonders what's wrong with this kid. Figures Tiny must have found a potion or something to get so strong. But he's convinced the boy is just another brat, so he grabs Tiny by the shirt and tries to lift him. Struggles greatly. Can't understand why the kid is so heavy. Tiny explains that, yeah, he's heavier than he looks. Tells the man to just give up. Then adds that he won't be able to do that anyway and kicks him hard enough to send him flying. Here's the secret. Tiny developed something in his past life, a technique he called his mana body. He's perfectly fused a copy of his mana body with his physical body, one that becomes more powerful through the interaction between the two. This was the core of the secret technique he created. The downside is that it requires him to eat much more than normal to be effective. That's why he consumed 10 days worth of food beforehand, but in exchange it gives him strength that shouldn't exist in a body this small. The protagonist reflects on something else he realized after remaking his mana body. A single mana awakening has an easier time finding its place in damaged bodies. So, ironically, he's thankful that these men broke his body once, made the process easier. He hurls the man like he weighs nothing. The body smashes through a door and passes by several others inside. They're alarmed by the intrusion, wondering who this kid is. Some notice he came alone and question what he'll do without a weapon. Tiny asks what they mean by that. Then with his bare hands he attacks, saying he does have a weapon, his own body. He uses it to defeat his enemies and throw them around as if their weight were light as paper. The mess is enormous. He fights multiple grown men with a child's body and makes it look easy because none of them are a match for him. Tiny even has fun beating his targets. When he finishes, everyone is on the ground. Some have lost teeth. First stage complete. He declares he's tired of dealing with small fry. What remains are the Ronner brothers. He asks why they won't come down to fight him. One of the brothers appears and declares he'll split Tiny in two. But as they face the boy, the other brother notices something. The kid is a mana user. They conclude that the body of a mana user can be sold for a good price. Always thinking about profit, these people. While Tiny is playing with one of the fallen bodies, using it casually like it's nothing, the two brothers try to catch him off guard. He tosses the body aside, saying it's already all broken. A flashback from his past life shows a moment when he was using a person as a weapon. One of his superiors called him crazy and asked him to show some class. Tiny asked how he could possibly do that. The superior said that instead of using cheap tricks like that, he could learn hand-to-hand combat. Back in the present, the protagonist thinks that with proper technique, he should be able to maintain his dignity, so he waits for the brothers to approach. Immediately after, he dodges their sword strikes and steps back, making one of them realize Tiny was able to predict their movements. He takes the opportunity to land a solid punch on the enemy's face. This amazes the other brother, but he's the next one to fall. Their fight doesn't last long. The protagonist easily defeats them both and goes straight to Wolf's room. The leader of Invader asks who the boy is. In his past life, Tiny did something similar. Back then he was older, and when he encountered Wolf, who was a pimp in a remote area, he learned something important. Wolf belongs to the Beastman tribe, considered the best among the demi-human races. Among them, the pure silver werewolf is special, possessing a trait usually found only in direct bloodlines of the Beastman royal family. It was very difficult to kill him in Tiny's past life. He didn't know why a silver wolf was in such a place back then, but this time he knows what awaits him. Wolf asks if the boy was the one who caused all this mess. Tiny asks if he can't deduce the answer himself, saying his intelligence must only go that far. Wolf calls him an insolent brat and promises to tear out his tongue. He begins transforming into his beastly form, and the protagonist says it would have been better if he attacked with everything from the start. Wolf's claws emerge along with hairy, animalistic paws. He transforms completely, but Tiny becomes confused. He says Wolf doesn't have gray fur as he imagined and asks what kind of dog he turned into. Wolf doesn't like being called that and launches into a furious attack. The protagonist wonders what's going on. Wolf is stronger and faster than the Ronner brothers, but he still dodges the attacks. He thinks Wolf cannot be compared to how he was in his past life. Something is different. Then he decides to end this and clamps the wolf's mouth shut, asking if the enemy thinks he came back just to see these weak attacks. Wolf is left in shock. Not only that, but he starts bleeding from the strength Tiny applied. Our guy has an advantage because he once heard from a Beastman companion how to handle their kin in berserker mode. Wolf becomes even more furious, but the protagonist manages to dodge all his strikes. He remembers his companion saying that beating is the best treatment for a rabid dog, which is exactly what Tiny does. But he tells Wolf not to die yet. He wants to beat him to death personally. The companion used to say it's fine to hit them a little since they have excellent regenerative abilities. Knowing this, Tiny doesn't hold back and beats the enemy severely, but as he comes across a wall, a crack reveals something unexpected, a magical seal. Immediately, Wolf returns to his normal state. Tiny asks if he's come to his senses. Scared, Wolf asks why the boy is doing this to him. The protagonist tells him to shut up, saying this won't end with just his spine this time. He also tells Wolf to beg for forgiveness for what he did to his sister. After feeling satisfied with the beating, Tiny says to his sister that he hopes he gave her some comfort for her pain. He tells Wolf that if it were up to him, he'd cut his head off and take it as an offering to her grave. This makes Wolf even more desperate, begging for forgiveness, saying he deeply regrets what he did. But Tiny's rage is still burning. Then he decides his sister probably wouldn't want to see Wolf's face after everything she went through. So, instead of killing him immediately, he decides to clear up some doubts. He asks Wolf what a beastman like him is doing in this place. But before that, he picks up a stone from the ground that fell from the enemy, says he's never seen one like it in his past life. Upon touching it, the protagonist is overwhelmed by strange energy. He wonders if this might be demonic chi. Inside the stone, he sees a silver wolf trying to escape. The wolf lunges at him, leaving Tiny quite surprised. A flashback. His friend Esta wanted to show him something about spirit creatures. These beings are reborn after accumulating mana for at least a century. Tiny didn't know such beings lived outside Elan, but he'd heard they were rare. Esta asked if he knew that the soul of a spirit creature was a spirit. He answered yes, even though he wasn't one. She then asked if he knew what the quintessence of a spirit was. As she spoke, she held a stone similar to the one Tiny now holds. Back in the present, he wonders why a werewolf possesses such a precious item. It's in a strange state emanating demonic chi typically found in demon spirit stones. Regardless, he needs to deal with this strange thing in the form of chains, so he punches the spirit creature. The chains break. Scenes appear in his mind. The spirit's memories. He sees the spirit surrounded by strange individuals, all of them possessing demonic chi, using it to fight the creature. Even as it tried to resist, the spirit wolf couldn't defeat them. With knives infused with demonic chi, they attacked and brought it down. They were after the spirit stone. A boy held the stone and handed it to another member of the group. The one who received it transformed into a werewolf. The protagonist realizes they were creating beastmen by making them absorb spirit stones. Wolf had been a child transformed this way. But since Tiny arrived too early this time, Wolf hadn't fully absorbed the power. That's why he appears different from how Tiny remembered him. The spirit wolf tries to attack Wolf, but Tiny stops it, saying this guy deserves a more miserable death. He realizes the spirit understood him and thinks it's incredible. He's sure he has no talent for taming spirits or animals. But he remembers Esta saying it was possible for a human to become a spirit tamer as long as they had a pure soul and enough mana. However, she also said only young children were pure enough to do so. Now, he's returned to his childhood state, but he doesn't think he's pure in the way Esta described. The wolf stares at him and approaches. Tiny realizes the wolf believes that when he broke the stone, his mana entered the spirit stone, filling the broken part. This is why they can communicate. As a result, Tiny asks if he can make a contract with the spirit wolf. The spirit answers yes. Unlike magic, this doesn't require him to focus on the spirit constantly. As long as he supplies the wolf with enough mana to survive, it will be a valuable ally. And most spirits grow stronger as the spirit tamer's strength increases. This was one of the reasons why Esta was one of the best among the 10 knights. But the protagonist realizes the wolf wants a favor. It seeks to use him to fulfill its revenge. Tiny says it's not a big deal. He explains he was already planning to kill everyone connected with demonic chi. The final step in contracting a spirit is deciding its name. He wonders what to call the wolf. Noticing the animal has fur as silver as the moon, he decides to name it Lunar Wolf. Now he wonders who was behind Wolf, transforming others into beasts with spirit stones. Seeing the demonic chi, they might be what he calls demon worshippers, fanatics who rejected God and work for demons. They caused chaos in the world even before the Demon King's army appeared. Tiny had been stuck in a labyrinth during that time, so he doesn't know much about them. Wolf is still begging for mercy. Tiny tells him to shut up and asks if the boy who gave him the spirit stone was a demon worshipper. But Wolf can't even respond properly, out of his mind with fear. Tiny asks the Lunar Wolf to wake him up with a roar. Wolf snaps back to reality. Tiny repeats the question. Wolf mentions an organization, and the protagonist demands more detail. But the deranged man isn't thinking straight. He says the organization won't let Tiny get away with this easily. Claims he himself was just a test subject for them. Finally starts to mention the great power they possess. But before he can finish, his head explodes. Even Tiny is surprised. He hadn't expected they would place a spell to prevent Wolf from revealing secrets. Though upon reflection, something like this had happened before in the past. Tiny had thought Wolf was referring to his subordinates on the first floor when he spoke of the organization coming after him. When he dealt with those men, they didn't even know Wolf was a beastman. For now, Tiny brushes it off, saying it's not as if he lives using his head anyway. Looking at the broken wall, he sees something important. He thinks he should start reclaiming what was taken from him. He uses Wolf's body to break the wall further. A vault is revealed. The protagonist wonders what the Sword Emperor would have done in this situation. He believes he can someday use the story the Emperor told him before he died. Tiny takes Wolf's hand and uses it to open the vault. To make his future ally trust him, he needs a specific item, which he finds inside. The Valencia family ring. A flashback. A woman approached a boy and asked his name. He replied that his name was Tiny. She said the name was cute and suited him. Then she took a ring from her finger and gave it to him, saying he should look for her with it and she would help him. Everyone living in the Empire knows who she is. Chloe von Valencia, the youngest daughter of the Sword Emperor Asgard von Valencia, known for her kindness and generosity since childhood. Back then she was called the Angel of Valencia. Everything changed around the time she turned 16. Because there's a tradition in the Valencia family where children who reach adulthood must place flowers in every temple in the Empire and make their names known. This must be why they met in Invader, the red light district of Phus, located on the borders of the duchy. In his past life, Tiny was unable to retrieve the ring because it took too long to seek vengeance, and getting help was difficult. But this time, the ring will be of great help. Now that it's in his possession, it should be much easier to meet the Sword Emperor. Suddenly, someone appears asking about the protagonist. Tiny already knew this person would show up. A man in shining armor enters the scene and is met with chaos everywhere. People mention how the protagonist grabbed one of their legs and swung it as a weapon, convinced he must be a mana user. The man is surprised that a child caused all this, but others confirm it and beg the knight to intervene. Irritated, the knight says this is why he told them to stop that nonsense, though they insist it's not related. The man then asks how Wolf has been managing his subordinates. This is Ian, the commander of the guards of the outer castle of Phus. He quickly thinks he can use his title as an excuse to increase his protection fee. But then Tiny descends the stairs. Ian asks if he was the one who caused all this mess. Tiny confirms it. The commander asks if he has any idea what he's just done. Tiny replies he was just taking care of some rotten scum and doesn't understand why a knight needs to show up for something like that. He also mentions it looks like the man was receiving a lot of bribes from Wolf. Despite being irritated, Ian says the boy has guts but launches an attack anyway. Tiny wonders if this knight has just reached the second level of mana. In any case, he prevents the attack, leaving Ian quite surprised since he didn't expect to be stopped so easily. Tiny thinks that even though he isn't strong enough yet, if he gives it his best, he might defeat this opponent. He attacks with a knee strike to the face. The impact is powerful, but the knight blocks with his hands, preventing greater damage. This makes Tiny think that for now, just demonstrating his power should be enough. The knight comments that he's quite skilled for a child, but Tiny can only think that he shouldn't make the feudal lord his enemy just yet. The number of knights under the lord's command is too many for now. Better to let this one leave on his own. Furious, Ian prepares to draw his sword, but Tiny is ready. From the top of the stairs, he summons his spirit wolf. Facing the creature head-on, the knight becomes visibly frightened. Tiny thinks the opponent has probably never seen a spirit in such a small fief. Since the knight has calmed down, he decides to make an offer. He states that this matter doesn't concern Ian as long as he gets paid. The knight asks what he's getting at. Tiny asks what he thinks about being paid by him instead of Wolf. Ian remarks that such words don't sound like they're coming from a child, asking how old the protagonist is and whether he transforms through magic. Tiny replies it's not magic. He's just a native of this place, somewhat famous in Invader because of his black hair. Ian asks if Tiny thinks he can pay the 5 white gold coins that Wolf would give. Tiny says he must be joking and asks how far he wants to take this, because he's certain Ian was only receiving 1 coin from Wolf. Tiny agrees to raise the payment to 1.5 coins. This enrages the knight, but Tiny says if he doesn't want the deal, they can settle the matter right now. Seeing the boy has the protection of a spirit wolf, Ian realizes he has no chance. He remarks that the world must truly be ending for a child to speak such things. Tiny asks for his answer. Ian says his payment date is the last day of the month, so Tiny must keep his promise. As he leaves, one of those present asks if the Lord's Knight will really let things end like this. Angrily, Ian punches the man in the face and tells him to shut up. Tiny tells the knight to wait and tosses a coin in his direction. Since ownership of this place has changed, the new owner should at least greet the feudal lord. He asks if Ian can arrange a meeting. The knight replies he'll report this to the lord, but warns the protagonist he'll feel the lord's wrath if he doesn't pay on time. Tiny says he's aware of that. Thinks to himself that this will only happen if there's a next payment date. Seeing Wolf's former subordinates fleeing, Tiny asks why they think they're going. He declares he'll give them 1 hour to gather all the women working in Invader and the children who beg in the streets. He warns that for every minute they're late, he'll kill 1 person. If they try to escape, his spirit will hunt them down. He tells them to run and not forget they only have 1 hour. Afterward, Tiny thinks if everything goes according to plan, it won't take even a week to deal with this place. He looks forward to meeting Duke Valencia. When the deadline is up, the men return with the people he demanded. Emma is among them. As soon as she sees Tiny, she asks what happened to his hand if someone hit him again. He replies that it's not his blood and points to Wolf, saying he's already dead. Emma wonders if this is really Wolf. Panic spreads among the others. They believe the feudal lord won't leave them alone now. People begin wondering what will happen, what punishment they'll face. But Tiny interrupts. He asks them, if challenging nobility is a grave sin, what will happen to the Lord of Philus who is making Duke Valencia look like a fool? Emma asks what he's talking about. In his past life, Tiny used to believe all nobles were the same, so even after looking at the ledger, he didn't think much of it. As part of the feudal lord's request, he handed over half of Wolf's fortune and the ledger. In return, he gained only some knowledge about Invader. But things are different. Emma remembers all the terrible things Wolf did. Anger overtakes her. She says she was the daughter of a prosperous merchant, and after Wolf ruined their lives, her father couldn't survive. She takes the opportunity to vent her rage on the corpse. Seeing Emma act this way encourages the others who also want revenge, especially for those who died after being beaten by Wolf. The furious women vent their anger on the dead body. Meanwhile, Tiny thinks he has no talent for comforting people. It doesn't suit his style of repaying a debt, because this won't be enough to heal all the wounds. Even so, he opens Wolf's vault and tells them they can take as much as they want. There's nothing better than money to help a bit with the process. He says this money belonged to Wolf. Any woman or child forced to stay an Invader should take the money and leave. They don't understand why he's offering this. Emma asks what will happen to him. He says he'll be fine and that she should take the money she needs. Emma says Tiny might not understand because he's still young, but there's no one in this world who doesn't need money. The protagonist asks where she thinks that money came from. Even if he sends all the bad guys to hell, the money will remain on Earth. Seeing the amount, the women get excited, but Tiny has something to say. He warns that if they commit any wrongdoing because of the money or speak a single word to the feudal lord, he will send his spirit wolf to take care of the rest. The wolf will track them all down and tear them to pieces. Then he tells Emma that if she's thinking of leaving Philus, he recommends going to Diane. He advises always traveling in groups and hiring mercenaries from a guild with good reputation. Emma doesn't want to leave without him, but Tiny says he has another place to go. She agrees, believing he's strong enough to take care of himself. She says they'll do as he suggested and go to Diane. Then she invites him to find her if his path becomes too difficult. Tiny says goodbye and thanks Emma for everything. From that day on, the red light district of Philus known as Invader is closed. Elsewhere, 2 guards are talking. One mentions he hasn't seen Lord Ram around for a few days, asking if he's on vacation or something. The other says he heard Ram is on probation because of that incident in Invader. His friend asks what the Lord did, if he doesn't remember the fight between the local thugs. The other guard asks if he means the time when they all hallucinated simultaneously, because no matter how they were questioned about that moment, they all said the same thing about a giant wolf chasing them. He remembers now. Not only that, but the leader of those men was unrecognizable when they found the body. All the money the former boss had simply disappeared. But he asks what that has to do with Lord Ram. His friend responds that while Ram was negotiating with the new boss, they had a problem. All the shops and warehouses were closed. The merchants who visited the city have many complaints since they're no longer making money. This has angered the feudal lord. That's likely why the lord summoned the new boss. While they're talking, Tiny listens in, hidden nearby. He introduces himself to the guards. They see the boy and ask how long he's been there. They say this is where the Lord lives, and an ordinary civilian shouldn't be sneaking around. But one of them asks how the boy knows the name of the new boss. Tiny responds that he is the new boss. To prove it, he shows them his wolf. They immediately run inside. After that, he manages to stand before a noble. But since he has the body of a child, he has to deal with others looking down on him. The Grandmaster of the Phila's Order of Knights, Cran, says he heard from Ram about Tiny but thinks the boy is quite young. Tiny simply asks if it's local etiquette to keep guests waiting while they observe them. The Grandmaster becomes irritated and says the boy needs to know where he is. Tiny says the same to him, telling the man not to mess around pretending to be superior to the feudal lord. He adds that he's a guest of the feudal lord, and despite knowing this clearly, the Grandmaster is trying to point his sword at him. Cran replies that as expected of someone who lives in filth, his tongue clearly stinks. Tiny says he didn't know about that, but to be honest, the stench is coming from Cran specifically, from the festering mouth in the Order of Knights. This infuriates the Grandmaster, but the butler tries to calm him down, saying the Lord is waiting. Cran knows this very well. The protagonist is relieved he no longer has to wait. The Grandmaster sheathes his sword and warns the boy to be careful inside, because the Lord is someone very strict in his thoughts. Cran affirms that he will kill the boy as soon as he has the Lord's permission. Anyway, Tiny goes to meet the Lord. Cran introduces him as Tiny from the alleys. The Lord tells him to come in. As soon as he enters the room, the protagonist is shocked. He wonders if that thing is the feudal lord. Nevertheless, he maintains his composure, saying it's an honor to meet the governor of Phyllis. The Lord asks where he learned such etiquette. Tiny responds he's been practicing for a while in preparation for this moment. His name is Baron Jimon Val Phyllis. After this, the Lord says the protagonist is very good at pretending to be a gentleman. Tiny hears this and thinks he can't get used to it. He also wonders if this is the same feudal lord he once knew. He remembers that back then, the Lord was addicted to drugs, so he wonders if this was the Lord's appearance before he started using. But putting that aside, the Lord was a noble in his past life and still is one now. The account book going to the Duke of Valencia will be his undoing thanks to Tiny. Regardless, he wants his proper revenge this time. The Lord says it seems the protagonist does not show the same courtesy to Master Cran. Tiny asks how the attitude of someone toward his master and toward one of the master's servants could be the same. He also says he wishes to be one of the Lord's servants. The Grandmaster can't believe what he's hearing. But in other words, the Lord says, the protagonist considers the Grandmaster his rival. To him, it seems the protagonist has great ambitions. However, he asks if the protagonist is sure he's young. He suggests Tiny might be a half-blood elf or dwarf. Tiny responds no, claiming to be only 13 years old. This surprises them. The Lord says it doesn't matter since the protagonist is now before his eyes. But for someone who wishes to be his servant, he states that the protagonist stole his money and asks if the boy would mind explaining this. Tiny responds that he did it for the Lord's own good. The Lord says he thought the boy was clever for his age, but it seems he still doesn't know how this world works. The Grandmaster says if the Lord wishes, he can eliminate the boy right now. But Tiny asks if the Lord knew that the Duke of Valencia has started a crackdown on drug trafficking and prostitution. This leaves the Grandmaster extremely surprised. The protagonist claims to know that the Lord is aware. Miss Valencia visited his land and acquired this information from her company. Tiny says he just wanted to clear things up for the Lord before it turned into chaos. He thinks this is the truth, so it doesn't matter if the Lord investigates it personally. The Lord says he heard about it during the coming-of-age ceremony for the youngest daughter of the Valencia family. They were planning something big. The Grandmaster tells the Lord that all of this is just the false ideas of a child and that Valencia is full of brothels. But the Lord interrupts him, telling Cran not to overstep boundaries, so he apologizes. Then the Lord says if the protagonist is telling the truth, despite the rough methods, it's something to be praised. Tiny thanks him. But the Lord says there's one more thing he needs to confirm. He states that he knows the boy controls the spirit of a wolf. He asks if it's a spirit the boy stole from the spirit wolf stone. Tiny wonders how the Lord knows that. But then the lunar wolf manifests and uses its aura to make the protagonist see through the Lord. With that, he can perceive a circle made of demonic energy surrounding the man. Soon Tiny imagines this can only mean the Lord is a black mage. He He knows that demons never lend their power without sacrifices. A second circle mage is certainly a lunatic who has already killed hundreds of people or made sacrifices. Tiny remembers that one of the guys who wanted to take his sister's body mentioned something about this. Not only that, but when he faced the brothers at Wolf's house, they also mentioned something similar. With that, he concludes the Lord is the one who has been buying bodies from Invader all this time. Not only that, but Wolf had a black mage behind him all along. Due to the protagonist's delay, the Lord asks why he's not speaking. Tiny claims he did not understand the question. Then the Lord orders Cran to attack. The protagonist realizes this is a problem. With his current power, he won't be able to defeat these two, so he tells the lunar wolf to attack. Seeing the wolf, the Lord says it truly is the master of the forest, and he cannot accept that such a spirit is in the protagonist's possession. Now that things have come to this, the Lord says they have no choice but to find a new test subject. Tiny realizes the Lord wants to use him in place of Wolf. The Lord asks how powerful this boy is. The Grandmaster responds that he will soon reach level 2, so the Lord understands he's already a match for a knight. And agrees, unless he comes from a notable family that trained him to manipulate mana from an early age, making him a genius. However, he states it's impossible for him to have learned all this on his own because there isn't a single drop of mana leaking from him and the circulation is also stable. Tiny says he learned this due to a secret legacy from his family. The Lord asks if the boy can answer him correctly now. Tiny thinks he should simply say someone taught him this, as they wouldn't believe him if he said he developed it on his own. So he tells the Lord he learned it from distant relatives before coming to Phyllis, a breathing technique he learned in childhood. As his strength grew, he realized it was a special method. In his thoughts, he wishes the Lord good luck trying to guess whether what he just said is true or not. He knows the Lord accepted refugees from everywhere to increase the income source of Invader. It will be impossible to track his records. After that, Tiny says the fact he's standing in front of the Lord would be proof of his words. The Lord says he will trust what the boy says. Tiny thinks it was easier than he imagined. But then the Lord says the only certainty is that he will judge. The protagonist doesn't know who he is. Even so, the Lord tells him to stay around for a few days. Since he killed Wolf, some things are causing problems. Then the Lord states he will have to pin the blame on someone. Tiny thinks he must be referring to the members of that organization Wolf mentioned. He considers that if the feudal lord is as cautious as he seems, he might be an incredible black mage. This makes the situation very dangerous. The Lord interrupts his thoughts, demanding an answer. He also says he wants the protagonist to be his sword. This shouldn't be a bad offer. Tiny simply says that if the Lord orders it, he will accept, believing himself to be a special guest. The Lord confirms this, saying the boy should be very careful with his actions in his presence. In his thoughts, Tiny notes that he still has a card to play. It will take about 3 days for the Duke's men to identify whether the account book is genuine or fake, another 3 days for the punitive army to be assembled, and about 10 more days for the army to arrive in Phyllis, maybe a little over 15 days. However, if the Lord's guest arrives after this period, everything will work out. So he asks the Lord when his guest will arrive. The Lord doesn't understand why he's asking. Tiny says his wish is to know this so he can use as much time as possible to learn proper manners. The Lord then says his guest will arrive in a week. He tells the boy not to disappoint him. With this news, the protagonist becomes deeply concerned. Now he knows he has only 1 week to prepare. He realizes he has 2 options. The first is to flee. The people of Invader must already be far away by now. He could leave if he wanted. Escaping from the Lord's men would be easy. However, if he does so, he's certain the Lord will put him on the wanted list. If that happens, things will become problematic, especially when he tries to meet the Sword Emperor. Since he needs something from him, Tiny must avoid anything that could cause trouble. But that's not the only thing bothering him. Just thinking about having to flee irritates him. Even though he doesn't yet have the same strength as in his past life, finding a way to overcome his opponents has always been his way of doing things. As for the second option, this guest arriving in a week, the protagonist wonders if it's really the Lord's official visitor. He remembers the feudal lord referred to this person as if they were some kind of high nobility, but he questions why the house is so empty considering a guest is about to arrive. Tiny concludes this must be some kind of obscure private visit. The person supporting the feudal lord is definitely not someone who can show themselves in public. If that's the case, he wonders what would happen if some kind of major unforeseen event occurred in Phyllis before this guest's arrival. A lot of attention would be focused on one place. There's a great chance this visit could be postponed or cancelled. Even though there's a high risk of failure, Tiny always approaches things this way. But for this task, he knows he needs to become stronger. With that, he will be able to defeat the Grandmaster and the Lord. After some time, he stops his training because he feels hungry and wants to find something to eat. In the dining hall, the cook is startled by what he sees and ends up spilling hot soup. The person he was serving asks where he's looking. But when that person also sees the scene, they're equally surprised, because they see the protagonist eating an absurd amount of food. They wonder how he can eat so much, speculating that he might have dwarf blood since they've heard dwarves eat as much as orcs. For his part, Tiny thinks his mana body, which has surpassed dissonance, improves whenever he eats. In other words, the more he eats, the stronger he becomes. Since that's the case, he doesn't need any medicinal herbs or anything of the sort. But upon seeing him eating this way, a knight approaches and asks if the boy learned good manners from a dog. Tiny simply responds that he did. The man becomes irritated and tells him to act respectfully when in front of an adult. Tiny asks how he can respect someone who is picking a fight with a little boy. This further irritates the man. He continues, saying he's not sure if the knight is trying to make him laugh or looking for a fight. Tells him to decide quickly. His provocations leave the man extremely furious. He lets his anger get the best of him, saying he's going to beat the protagonist. Seeing his colleague about to explode, another knight tries to calm him down, stating the protagonist is just a child. However, the one who tried to calm him down is reprimanded because the Grandmaster approaches, telling him to stay seated and not interfere. Tiny seems to have already figured everything out. With further provocations, he tells the knight that he can attack with full force, claiming he thought the man wanted to know how strong he is. Hearing this, the knight tells the boy not to regret it later. With that, Tiny simply thinks the Grandmaster should stay still and just watch. Not only that, but he also knows the feudal lord is behind all of this. Outside the dining hall, everyone gathers to watch the fight between the two, including the Grandmaster, who is the most eager. The knight named Grant claims he will put the boy in his place. Tiny asks if he's really sure about that. Grant tells the boy to grab his sword, stating he'll finish this quickly and asking if he's not scared now. However, Tiny scoffs at his opponent and doesn't even grab a weapon. Then he lands a kick on the knight's shin, which causes him immense pain. But Grant tries to hold back so as not to show weakness. Next, he attempts to strike the boy. However, the protagonist is more agile than he expected. After that, Tiny prepares to deliver another kick and ends up hitting his opponent's other leg. Grant can't believe he's been hit twice. He wonders if this is really the power of a mere level 1. Looking at his leg, he notices it's already swollen, yet he thinks he cannot lose to a child. Meanwhile, the protagonist thinks his opponent is quite resilient. But driven by pure rage, the knight tries to attack him. Tiny once again manages to evade and prepares to attack again, which leaves Grant even more astonished. Then Tiny leaps toward his opponent and grabs him with his legs. He tells Grant not to worry because he won't kill him. The protagonist merely knocks his opponent out. Then he loudly and ironically asks if knights are really this weak. Everyone is utterly surprised. They can't believe Sir Grant lost to a child. Tiny stares directly at the Grandmaster, who in turn is furious about what happened. But Grant simply turns and leaves. The protagonist concludes that he intentionally defeated a knight in front of numerous people without the help of the lunar wolf. He knows there aren't many people capable of doing that. Now he thinks the feudal lord will become increasingly hesitant to get rid of him. With that, he says in his thoughts that the probability of success has increased. He loses his balance for a moment and wonders if he overexerted himself, but he thinks he had no choice in such a situation since he had to use mana for this. If it were in his past life, he would have faced many problems because while his body recovered quickly, he was still at a disadvantage due to slow recovery of mana. However, in this life, his body is in harmony with his mana, so that disadvantage is a thing of the past. Now he can train as much as he wants. He can become even stronger than in his previous life. The next day, the movements in the duchy turn out to be true. The Lord says he made a mistake with the protagonist. Tiny thanks him for his consideration and trust. The Lord then tells him to enjoy the veal steak and feel free to eat the other dishes as well. Tiny comments that it seems like a bit much for breakfast. However, the Lord asks if his strength doesn't come from large quantities of food. The protagonist replies that what happened with that knight yesterday was a fluke. Hearing this, the Lord tells him not to be modest. He claims the protagonist's future is very promising and laments that there isn't a good master to teach a genius like him. From what he's heard, the Lord says the greatest knights in history grew up alone without masters. But Tiny says what made them grow was having a great lord to follow. The Lord is surprised that the boy knows about history and etiquette, making it clear the protagonist is no ordinary commoner. In his thoughts, Tiny says he had an entire previous life to learn these things. Returning to the Lord, he says that both in the Empire and in neighboring kingdoms, this type of appearance with black hair and black eyes is very rare. However, if you include that, it becomes difficult to guess. The protagonist doesn't understand what he means. In any case, the Lord says he never thought a foreigner could be worth so much. Once again, Tiny doesn't understand. But the Lord says he will be able to explain in more detail. He talked about the protagonist to him, and it seems it pleased him a lot. Tiny doesn't understand any of it, and thinks the Lord is definitely a crazy drug addict. He also thinks the Lord is only in such good condition because of the power of the circle, but one can never know when the demon will strike. In his past life, Tiny imagines the demon must have abandoned the Lord and removed the circle. For his part, the Lord says he is eager to meet the boy. He also says the protagonist cannot imagine how good he is, and he will definitely make great use of him. Tiny thanks him for this precious opportunity. After the meal, he returns to his training. The protagonist is worried about him and the organization, but he thinks now is not the time to dwell on that. He needs to prepare. He knows the Lord is in the second circle. Grandmaster Cran of the second stage is slightly stronger but still comparable because the level of a mage and a mana user are similar. The protagonist passed the second stage a long time ago in his past life, but now he has to reach that level again. He imagines 6 days will be enough. 3 days after this realization, he notes that his body is still small but already quite strong. Just as much as his strength and weight were compressed, his elasticity has increased, and his movements are even better than in his past life. It seems Tiny has rebuilt the foundation entirely. He thinks perhaps the problem was his monstrous size in his previous life. He only wanted to be big and strong, and his body connected to his mana responded to that unconsciously. The harmony between his body and his mana was broken because he grew too large. But now that he's reverted to a child state, he concludes he doesn't need to be so big to be strong. While training, he notices some movement. A few guards appear and identify him as the boy who defeated Lord Grant. They then leave, saying it's better to return later. Tiny feels grateful that they're avoiding him, giving him more space to train. After eating heavily for 3 days and training for hours with the dummies, everyone eventually loses their curiosity. Now they slowly start avoiding him. However, the captain approaches. The protagonist asks what he wants. The captain tells Tiny to follow him because the Lord has instructed them to give the boy a weapon. Upon seeing the enemy's sword, Tiny thinks the timing couldn't be more perfect. The captain says the boy doesn't realize how much the Lord thinks of and cares for him. He tells him to be grateful. Meanwhile, the protagonist looks around. He sees an armor set which he thinks is very expensive but fits him perfectly. However, when looking at the weapons, he doesn't see any axes or warhammers. He thinks he will need to spend his savings. After this, he asks the captain if he can take something like his sword. The captain asks if his sword looks like something mass-produced. He says the sword's name is Grills, crafted by Rogers, a renowned swordsmith. It's a luxury artifact. He also says that a little bird doesn't eat stones. Yet, the protagonist can only think about how much blood must have been spilled by that sword. Even so, he says the sword suits him more than the captain. He claims this sword should be in the hands of someone more talented, for the Lord's sake. Hearing this, the captain bites back his anger. He calls the boy insolent and asks if he's trying to get himself killed. But the protagonist asks if he wants to test his skills right now. Then he holds the sword as if it weighs nothing, saying that if he loses, he will hand his head to the opponent on a platter. As if the captain wasn't furious enough, this provocation makes him attack the boy with all his strength. Outside the armory, the guards only hear the commotion. They listen to the protagonist apologizing, saying he'll be more careful. But then the boy walks out of the room. Though injured, he's carrying the sword he wanted so much. The guards who see this wonder if Captain Cran hit a child. They think that even though Tiny is exceptionally skilled for his age, this will be a problem. They also wonder if it's true that the captain dislikes this boy, as rumors suggest the protagonist might even take the captain's place in the future. Still, they think it's wrong for a captain to hit a child. But in any case, they decide it's none of their business and go about their lives. As he walks through the corridors, some maids, upon seeing the protagonist injured, ask what happened to him. Tiny replies that the captain said they were going to fetch a weapon. He agreed to go with him, and then this happened. The maids tell him to go rest and call them if he needs anything. Back in the Lord's chamber, he asks what's happening with the sacrifice. His servant replies that it's secure. So the Lord asks if more bodies appeared again today. The servant confirms. The Lord thinks this boy is turning Invader upside down. With that, he dismisses the servant. He says he doesn't know what the boy is plotting, but he has to put an end to it. Because he imagines in a few days the boy's lineage will be confirmed, and then they will be able to proceed. There's just one problem. The Lord thinks that if the protagonist belongs to that family, then of course, as the owner of that wolf, he will have to pay a terrible price. However, he hopes that won't happen. Because seeing how knowledgeable and well-mannered he is, it's clear the protagonist came from a family of great prestige. Moreover, even though he's very talented, someone his age could never defeat a knight, probably because he must have mastered the vision of that family. And above all, the protagonist has those black eyes and hair. For the Lord, there's no clearer evidence than this. He can't wait to see him. However, as he lies down to sleep, he hears a sound, an alarm spell. He wonders if it's a servant. If so, he wants to know who would dare disturb him unnecessarily. He claims he will take this person and use them as a sacrifice. Then he tries to rise from his bed. But soon after, he sees someone approaching with a sword. Unable to defend himself, he is struck directly. The Lord can only scream in pain and spit blood. Tiny, who attacked him, says this is divine punishment. Even injured, the Lord asks why he was attacked. But the protagonist doesn't care. He stabs his heart until the Lord bleeds to death. Afterward, he leaves the Lord's chamber. He leaves the sword embedded in the body. The next morning at dawn, one of the maids finds the Lord's body and screams. Thus the other servants gather. Some notice that the Lord was a black mage. One of the knights says the priest was already there and mentioned he could detect demonic energy, so he would report it to the parish. His name is Glenn, a member of the Phyllis Knights. He says an investigative team from the Empire will be sent soon. Another guard asks why the Lord's body remains like this. He thinks it has already been several hours since the Lord died. They say the bodies of black mages rot immediately after death. They find this situation horrible and wonder why the Lord made that choice. Glenn thinks the Lord abandoned the lineage and honor of being an imperial noble and was executed as soon as it was discovered. Then he says there's no way to question a dead person, but there's still something unclear. After that, he examines the sword more closely and realizes it's the captain's sword. However, the others don't believe the captain would do such a thing. One of them mentions that the boy managed to meet the Lord alone given his excellent skills. He also says there was talk about a new captain, so he concludes the current one might have snapped after hearing this. Another guard asks if he would kill the Lord just for that. He wouldn't do such a thing unless he was insane. However, they question, if that's the case, why hasn't the captain appeared yet? Glenn says he has a bad feeling about this and decides to do some investigations. Soon, he talks to several people. After interviewing all the guards and servants, he discovers that the captain beat Tiny a day ago. Finally, they gather all the testimonies and Glenn tells them to summon the boy. Facing Glenn, the protagonist says the captain mentioned that the Lord ordered him to fetch a weapon, so he accompanied him to the armory. But he didn't imagine that all along the captain just wanted to beat him. Furthermore, he didn't receive any weapon. Glenn becomes irritated. He states the warehouse has already been inspected. There were some traces, but the captain wasn't there. No one has seen him anywhere. He alleges the captain vanished like a ghost after meeting the boy. Then he asks if the protagonist truly didn't meet the captain after that. Glenn insists on his question, but Tiny states that he did not meet the captain. Then Glenn asks if he doesn't find that strange. Tiny says he's somewhat worried that Glenn isn't taking him seriously. He also says he's not happy to hear that, but insists he's telling the truth. Glenn thinks this matches the testimony of the staff showing concern. The protagonist asks what will happen to him, claiming that the master had said his future was secured. Glenn simply tells the boy to come back earlier, then lets him go. Tiny thinks this knight is one of the bastards living there but wonders why he doesn't remember him. He asks himself if he just forgot, but after thinking about it carefully, he remembers perfectly killing all of them in his past life. He then thinks it would be suspicious if he returned to the room after being interrogated. He concludes he cannot be careless. After some time, he returns to the room and receives a mercenary plate and money from Glenn. Glenn says that only commoners with the status of mercenary or merchant can freely enter other provinces. He affirms that he personally verified the identity. Tiny thinks he really wanted one of those, but he asks why he's being given this out of the blue. The knight tells the boy that playing around in a rotten place will only waste his talents. He advises him to go play in better places. He claims this is advice from a life veteran. Upon hearing this, Tiny thinks this is advice the knight himself wishes to follow. Now he understands why he hasn't seen Glenn before. Glenn must have left the place. Regardless, Tiny thanks him and says he thought he should leave anyway. He thinks that now that the Black Mage is dead, the Imperial family must act. The protagonist prevented him from making a move, but the Duke's investigation team hasn't appeared, so he concludes he'll have to go personally. Glenn tells the protagonist that if he succeeds on his journey, he must not forget about him. Tiny asks what his name is again. Glenn is shocked that the boy doesn't know his name. A bit embarrassed, he introduces himself as Glenn Liberty, but says the boy can just call him Glenn. The protagonist then says that Glenn also needs to remember his name. Then he leaves, thinking that Phyllis is without a lord. As its leader at the moment, everything is in the hands of that knight. In a way, Tiny feels guilty. As the knight said, he would need a mage specialized in tracking to find the captain. Thus, Tiny has left an unsolvable problem behind. Now that he has a mercenary plate, he plans to borrow a horse from the guild for transportation. But immediately, the lunar wolf appears. The protagonist understands that the wolf is offering itself as a mount, but he says riding it gives too many jolts over long distances. Not only that, but he claims a human riding a wolf's back will vomit everything in their stomach within 10 minutes. He argues he is too slender to have the same balance as an orc. But the wolf doesn't care, and forces the protagonist onto its back. Tiny in turn comments that the animal is still a bit small, because spirits usually materialize at the size they had when alive, but they can also materialize in proportion to the mage's size. While using the wolf as a mount, Tiny realizes their souls and senses must first become one, so he decides to try. Soon, he uses a level 2 spiritualist ability, Condemnation of Sensory Soul Link. Immediately, the wolf's body begins to transform. It becomes stronger than before, surprising the protagonist. With this, he remembers his old friend asking what could be done by becoming a spiritualist. She claimed each domain is different, but the mage's traits manifest in the spirit. Strength and endurance. Those are the mage's traits. But shortly afterward, the wolf takes off. It runs at an astonishing speed. The protagonist notices that all his senses are heightened as they are connected to the wolf's senses, his vision and his sense of smell. He imagines he will save a lot of time reaching Valencia. He concludes he can travel farther and faster this way, possibly even reaching Quran, where the first catastrophe will occur. In his previous life, as if heralding the arrival of the Demon King, many catastrophes emerged one after another. This greatly weakened humanity's strength. It all began with the disappearance of Quran's relic. something the protagonist thinks he must prevent from happening. The treasures of humanity granted by the goddess. The 7 sacred relics. This was supposed to be the final sacrifice, but in his past life these relics were stolen. However, in this life, Tiny wants to overcome all these disasters and become the greatest warrior, because he wants to join the human army against the Demon King. The first catastrophe. In Quran, the Kingdom of the Sea. That's where the protagonist wants to go. If you enjoyed the story so far, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to Yume Recap, and stay tuned for the next video.